50-minute introduction to philosophy and theory live stream in which I am proud and pleased to announce that I have just released my latest ebook. It is titled Sisyphus in Love. And what we're going to be doing this class is we're going to be talking about the contents of that book. So all the ideas in this live stream are developed further in my newest ebook called Sisyphus in Love, which is a book about Žižek's Ontology, the Hegelian conception of love, the Lacanian idea of loving the lack in the other, and many other things. But first, as per usual, I'd like to greet everybody, both on Instagram and YouTube. Hello. And if you would like to do me a massive favor, then I'd really be happy to hear where you are joining me from. So if you feel like dropping a comment, I see the first one from Manila. Hello, Manila. That's amazing. It really genuinely makes me so incredibly happy to see where you guys are joining me from. That is why I do this above all. I see Moscow. Hello, greetings. It looks a bit like Moscow out here. You can see the snow, deeply packed snow. Poland, Norway, Mexico. Another user from Poland. Hello, Nepal. Again, it looks a bit like Nepal outside. Very snowy. Tokyo. Good morning, Tokyo. Romania. That's incredible. Colombia, hello Colombia, India, Nepal again, San Diego, hello San Diego, I see you, hello Tunisia, hello and Nepal again, yes, hello Spain, Glasgow, hello, good morning Glasgow. I used to live near Glasgow actually. Lebanon, that's beautiful. Turkey, Merhaba Turkey. So incredibly grateful that you are joining us here today. It really makes me very happy. I see Finland, I see Switzerland. I could do this for an hour. I really enjoy that. To me, that is what makes this project worth doing, is getting to share these vibes with you around the world. Lithuania, South Africa. We keep adding countries that like I hadn't seen before. Florida, USA, hello. Saudi Arabia, Florida, Hong Kong, France. It's incredible. Thank you guys so much. I'm so grateful. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today, and yes, some of you were observing that I have a new haircut. I'm not sure if it's worth the name haircut. It doesn't look great. I realize that, but it's shorter, so there's that, and it will grow out eventually. Today, what we're going to be doing is I'm very pleased, very proud to announce that I have just published my latest ebook. It is titled Sisyphus in Love, and it is a 100-page, very highly readable, short, condensed version of the lecture series that I taught here on love. And so what we're going to be doing in this session is I'm going to be introducing the key ideas of that book, Sisyphus in Love, so that hopefully if you enjoyed this class and you want to read more about it and you want to see those ideas developed further, you can then go to the Patreon to download the actual book. The ebook is available exclusively for patrons on Patreon, and the link is www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. And a big thank you to my wonderful wife, Jeneline, who edited the book and who put together the text based on the transcripts. It's always an interesting proposition to take 12 weeks of lectures and to compress them into a 100-page book. But I think we've succeeded. Of course, every time I look at it, I still find some typos that I wish I could have caught. But overall, I'm very proud of this one. And if you'd like to sign up today, and thank you very much for the endorsement in the comments, you will also get access to all of our community features, including a bonus Q&A podcast that I record after each and every lecture that I post to the Patreon, as well as edited transcripts for every lecture, as well as audio downloads for every lecture I've ever recorded, which by now are about 200, I'd say, masterclasses that I've posted, as well as the ebook, Sisyphus in Love. So if you'd like to help me support this project, and this is really how I keep doing this project financially, please do consider joining what I think is the coolest learning community on the internet, perhaps the only learning community on the internet. Please go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian, or click the link in bio on Instagram, and on YouTube, I'm going to put a link in the description so that you can find that there. Of course, I do want to very briefly say a huge, massive thank you to all of our patrons who have made this book possible. Without you guys, none of this would be still going. We started this during the pandemic with like 18 people, And by now it's a thing, and I love doing it. It gives me so much joy. I love feeling connected to like-minded thinkers around the world, and it really genuinely is because of our patrons. Our patrons who, on behalf of everybody else, fund these classes, allow me to keep making them open access and free for everybody. So a huge thank you to our patrons, and I hope that you enjoyed the book. The book is a way of saying thank you to all the patrons for supporting this open access learning community. So thank you guys so much. Truly thank you. Okay, so let us dive right in. Thank you for being here. I want to start with a couple of things. I'm not just going to summarize the book. This is going to be a lecture because otherwise it would be boring. But I do want to start with explaining the title. So the book is titled Sisyphus in Love. And the question that I believe one should ask is therefore, Sisyphus in love with what? What is Sisyphus in love with? Now, those of you who have read Camus will know that Sisyphus is, in a sense, in love with his fate. He is in love with his own fate, the fate of pushing the boulder up the hill, up the mountain, and seeing it roll down. In other words, his struggle. Yes, thank you very much. Sisyphus is in love with his struggle. And there's a Lacanian word for that as well. And the Lacanian concept for that is the symptom, or what Lacan calls symptôme. And Lacan actually says that the definition of successful psychoanalysis would be for the patient to identify with their symptom. And if you will, here we have a direct line that we can draw from the Lacanian insight to the absurdist insight, which is that rather than fixing Sisyphus, rather than curing him of his ailment, that in a sense, Sisyphus is a metaphor for all of us, that we each have our own cross to bear, that we each face our own unbearable struggles, that while we all may suffer differently, we do suffer universally. And that this doesn't have to be a terrible or nihilistic proposition, that there's a kind of beauty, a kind of sublime entity within the seeming meaninglessness of life, that perhaps the very precondition for meaning in life is the fact that we experience it as having no meaning. Of course, this isn't to say that we should love our abusers. It's not to say that we should love our fate and simply try to incrementally better our own selves instead of trying to find community with others. It's not a nihilistic gesture. Instead, it's a very hopeful gesture. Lacan says that the definition of successful psychoanalysis, as I said before, is therefore loving your own symptom, identifying with your own symptom. And symptom could be seen as another word for struggle. That once you realize that what life is the embrace of struggle, life becomes beautiful, life becomes meaningful. You realize that you have agency, that you have freedom, that freedom is not the absence of any obligations. Freedom is being able to choose your own obligations and the manner in which you deal with them. That money and being rich isn't about having all the money in the world. It's about having enough so that you don't need to buy the things that other people make you think you need. Like, there's so many ways in which we realize that we are already content. We are already wealthy. We are already powerful, more content, more wealthy than we think we are. And this embrace of one's own fate, this idea of Sisyphus in love with his symptom, Sisyphus in love with his struggle, is the central idea around which this book is built. And yet, those of you who know me know that I tend to put together an amor fati, exactly, thank you very much for adding that, I see that in the comments, amor fati, love your fate, or love of fate, which is sort of the Nietzschean elaboration on this idea. Of course, those of you who know me know that this is fundamentally a book about three things: about Žižek's philosophy, about Lacanian psychoanalysis, and Hegelian speculative idealism, i.e. philosophy. And so what I've done in this book is I've tried to explain a couple of things. I tried to explain why Žižek refers to love as a disaster, why Žižek argues that you can't have love without the fall, what the Lacanian conception of the symptom and of love is, what the political application of the idea of love is that we take from Žižek's philosophy, and ultimately, and I think this is actually the most important and most technical argument in the book, not important because I said it, but important because it's hard to understand, is that Hegel is perhaps the preeminent philosopher of love. In fact, that if you want to make Hegel more easily understandable, if you want to understand, if you will, Hegel's ontology or his phenomenology of spirit, you have to understand the way in which Hegel employs the idea of love. And so the basic idea was to take love very seriously, to take the concept of love and to apply it philosophically, psychoanalytically, and politically. And one of the arguments that I make at the very end of the book is that if you are someone who is engaged politically or as a leftist or as a philosopher, as an artist, as a thinker, that love remains at the forefront of struggle. That love is another word for struggle. That, if you will, attention is another word for struggle, and attention is another word for love. This is something I believe very strongly, that there are ways in which we give attention to others and to the world that becomes a way of loving. Because once you give attention to something, you find grace in it. Everything becomes beautiful once you give attention to it. For example, if you have a camera with you or you have a notebook with you, these are attention-generating machines. Because you start looking at the world differently. You start thinking, can I take a picture of this? How would I frame it? You start wanting to write about your experiences. Once you start channeling the world through writing, through thought, through photography, through art, you have thereby given attention to the world, rather than giving your attention to the algorithm. And that therein we find a kind of resistance. Anyway, all that aside, that's basically what the book's about, and now I'm going to sort of elaborate on some of these ideas. I want to talk about Elon Musk, I want to talk about the question of universal love, I want to talk about the politics of universal love, and I want to talk a little bit more about Hegel and Žižek. That's what we're going to do. Quick plug, if you'd like to read this book called Sisyphus in Love, and now you know that it means Sisyphus in love with his symptom or with his struggle, in other words, Sisyphus in love with his fate, you can find that ebook exclusively on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. For those of you on YouTube, I'm going to put up the link later, but it's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Okay, so now I'm going to start developing some of these ideas. So those of you who've been following what's happening in the world, or at least in the world of internet, Elon Musk recently acquired Twitter. And what was very interesting about this was that one of Elon Musk's stated intents in purchasing Twitter, in other words, one of the reasons that he gave for purchasing Twitter, on Twitter of course, was that he loves humanity, that he was doing it out of a love for humanity. In fact, Elon Musk a while back tweeted that while others hate humanity, Elon loves humanity so much. Of course, it's easy to immediately have a cynical, somewhat snarky Twitter reply to this about whether or not Elon Musk loves his workers, whether they count as humanity, etc. But that's not my intention here. Instead, I want to investigate this idea of universal love, of loving humanity, of loving everyone, if you will. Now, one of the critiques within the history of philosophy, not just leftist philosophy or theory, one of the critiques of love has always been the idea of universal love, the love of humanity. Of course, contemporary leftist critiques thereof argue that the love of humanity is perhaps the perfect capitalist commodity. Think about one of the most recognizable brands in the world, McDonald's, and their slogan, as you of course probably also know, is "I'm loving it." This idea of love as a universally applicable attitude or a mindset that thereby lends itself to a kind of abstraction that occurs within the commodification of capitalism is part of a leftist critique of love. And yet it goes further back yet. We see this within Nietzsche, we see it even within Plato, this idea that love is a particularizing agent. Perhaps nobody knew this more than Kierkegaard, who left the love of his life, famously, in order to dedicate himself to the love of philosophy and the love of God. In this sense, Kierkegaard is one of the first philosophical fundamentalists, in that he believes that love is a fundamentally alienating agency, that love doesn't draw you into the world, love actually pushes you out of the world. Something that Hannah Arendt already argued, that when you fall in love, you actually become a world unto yourself. That love, even though it is universal, all of us feel like we've discovered it for the first time. That when we are in love with someone, a clear sign of it is that we actually want to spend more time with that person and less time with others. That love can be dangerous in a sense, that love alienates us. And of course, we're back again at this idea that the commodification of universal love, that we are all love and everything is love, and if we participate in the consumer economy, we're loving ourselves, etc. This idea of love as a binding agent actually serves to neuter the alienating core within love itself. And as I'll try to show at the end of this lecture, here we actually have something very important within the Hegelian philosophy, which we will then also find within Marx, which is that alienation is not strictly speaking a bad thing. That alienation is a necessary step within what Hegel would call the negation of negation. That the step away is in fact a step towards the new form of consciousness. But again, that's very abstract, so we'll get there. So this critique of the idea of universal love, the universal love that Elon Musk was expressing, that he loves humanity, was something that we saw within Hegel's idea of good and evil. Hegel's theory of good and evil is relatively simple, if you will, which is that, you may have heard this before, that evil is simply that which believes itself to be wholly good. That which believes itself to be acting out of love for humanity or the greater good, that believes itself to be the embodiment of the absolute, of the good, is thereby the face of evil itself. That acknowledging, as Miyazaki once said, the importance of seeing the world through eyes unclouded by hate, thereby requires that we see not just the good within evil, but precisely with the evil within good. And this idea of loving humanity, an sich, as you would find, an sich being German, usually used by Freud, but also used by other German thinkers, for example, by Hegel and by Nietzsche, an sich, for itself. The idea of love for itself. Love is a universalizing agent, is again something that we see criticized within, for example, Hannah Arendt or Primo Levi. Primo Levi realized, he had a horrific insight writing about the concentration camps in the Holocaust. Primo Levi being one of the foremost writers of the experience of having undergone the concentration camps. Primo Levi wrote that one of the horrifying realizations of having lived through the Holocaust was that part of the ideology that led to the Holocaust was the universalization of Jewish life, of Jewish experience. That in an almost tragicomic way, when Primo Levi was imprisoned with other Jewish men and women, he realized how different they were. That he was discovering Jews who came from Italy, and he was with Jews who came from Poland, neither of which languages he spoke, and that they had very different approaches to life. Some of them were carpenters, others were artists. And Primo Levi had this horrifying realization, which was that the idea of the Jew, capital J, the universalization of Jewishness, was on the side of evil. That in order to create the anti-Semitic energy of the Nazis during World War II, they had to create the idea of a universal Jewish plot, of a universal scapegoat, of an enemy, the idea of the capital J Jew. That, of course, was entirely detached from reality, which was the fact that having been dispersed over the European and African continent, there was no such thing as the lived Jewish experience. And this is one of the deeply paradoxical, tragic elements within Primo Levi, was the realization that the universal, which we usually posit to be on the side of good, the universal usually being posited as the end goal of a transcendental philosophy, was thereby the face of evil itself. That to realize what actual Jewishness meant was to insist on difference, on particularization, on the multitude of identities that took place within the nomer of a religious ethnic identity. And that the achievement of the Nazis thereby hadn't been to split the Jewish people, but it had precisely been to unify them into a false universal under which horrible crimes were committed. It's an important idea, I believe, because we've thereby also identified some of the problems within the idea, for example, of multiculturalism, within the idea that what we need is to come together. Now, of course, it's important to argue that we have common goals and shared values and that we ultimately want to create compromises. Of course, the leftist critique of compromise is simply to use the word hegemony. Hegemony thereby meaning that any compromise, any agreement, is simply a temporary realignment of power. And yet, the argument about false universals is fundamental to understanding any Marxist critique, any Hegelian critique. Namely, the idea that the ideas that are universal, as Marx put it, are the ideas of the ruling class. That ideas don't simply become universal by themselves. That we have temporary normative moments in which certain ideas become, if you will, mainstream. Mainstream, of course, being simply the contemporary way of referring to the idea of the universal. If something is mainstream, then it is held by many, if not most people, to be true or to be accepted. This is also one of the problems within the idea of political correctness, which I really think is important to emphasize, had its origins as a leftist critique before it became embraced as a right-wing reactionary stance about quote-unquote cancel culture. The critique of political correctness has to be linked directly to the idea of the critique of the false universal. That whenever there is an agreement on how something ought to be said or framed, and that this has to be enforced collectively, we thereby have again an instance of the false universal. Now, of course, I don't want to delve too deeply into this, but the libertarian argument that we thereby should have a market economy of ideas by which the best ideas trickle to the top is the worst example of the false universal. Namely, the idea that ideas would function according to a universal principle, aka the idea of the market, by which the interaction of said ideas would naturally regulate themselves in order to scale a normative taxonomy of what are good or bad ideas. This itself is the ultimate ideological stance, a false universal that consists solely of the seemingly disembodied principle of good ideas versus bad ideas. This is what we should always be most skeptical of. In fact, libertarianism presents itself as the ultimate arbiter of seemingly empirical reason, and yet presents itself precisely as a false universal, by positing a seeming abstract, invisible hand of God, if you will, that will be the ultimate arbiter of said development. It's funny because we find within libertarianism almost the remnants of a kind of old-fashioned orthodox determinism that Marxism was once ridiculed for, namely the idea of an inevitable progress if we let loose the creative forces of human agency upon themselves. Anyway, I want to rein this in because I want to develop the ideas that are in the book, not introduce too many new ones. And so the critique of the false universal, the idea of saying, where do mainstream ideas come from, is central to the Marxist critique, but also central to the Hegelian critique. Because what is Hegel's philosophy, if not simply the questioning of the universal, and pointing out that the universal, which is the central goal of philosophy, right, the transcendental goal of reaching capital T truth, is thereby perhaps a false one. Hegel's famous aphorism, substance equals subject, is the first critique of the idea of a universal. Because if substance equals subject, then the universal is thereby marked by difference, marked by that which is supposed to be antithetical to it, namely the objects. This is also part of Žižek's argument where he calls it the fragile absolute that falls into its own difference. Hegel refers to this as the genus and the species. In fact, Hegel has an argument that is sort of avant la lettre, a Marxist argument about historical progression. In a sense, Marx's theory of history is simply that whenever we have a universal, which is thereby a false universal, it has to be sustained by ideology. And that what happens is that this ideology creates its own internal limit from within which the new will grow. In other words, the emergence of something new, something excessive, through its own contradictions. Hegel has an argument that is much more intuitive than this, by which he uses a historical example that makes this exact same point. The argument that Hegel uses is the assassination of Caesar. Remember, the assassination of Caesar was happening under the auspices of defending or resurrecting the Republic. And yet it was precisely the assassination of Caesar that ended the Republic, that led to the Augustinian rule. And this almost ironic reversal, by which a stated intent leads to its perceived opposite, is a central part of the Hegelian idea of the dialectical progression of history. Namely, the only way for the Republic to truly end was thereby not the reign of Caesar, but it was precisely the intervention on behalf of the Republic that marked the end of the Republic. In fact, for Hegel, Caesar had simply realized that the internal contradictions of the Republic had inevitably led to the moment in which a Caesar was necessary. And ironically, it's the resistance to Caesar that cemented the deal, that ended the Republic. Something that we could perhaps think about in our own contemporary moment as well. Of course, Hegel is also thinking here of Napoleon and the way in which the French Revolution had to lead to a Napoleonic figure. And so Hegel's idea is that resistance or negation is never antithetical. In other words, it's never simply in opposition to, but that it actually is a driver of progress. That negation doesn't happen external to the universal, but it happens immanently or within it. That instead of going from A to B to C, the famous Fichtean triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, synthesis and antithesis has already taken place within thesis to begin with. Hence the famed Hegelian, I don't know, if you will, Homeric adverb almost of always already. Always already seemingly meaning that there is no solid foundation. There is no a priori. There is no an sich. There is no universal to begin with. There is simply that universal which is marked by its own difference, which for a seeming period of time can be disavowed, to put it in psychoanalytic terms, and that thereby the idea of universality in its truth is precisely marked by falsehood. That to fall into the particular is not to distance yourself from the universal, but precisely to materialize it, to sublate it or sublimate it, as Hegel called it. This is all very theoretical, and I develop it much more in the book. Now, why is love, to return to the idea of love, why would love thereby be so important for understanding the Hegelian ontology? For those of you joining without a background in philosophy, which I hope is the majority of you, ontology and teleology are two central ideas or principles or concepts. Ontology is the question into the nature of being. Teleology is the question into the nature of purpose. One of the things that Hegel does, which is an innovation made possible by Kant's critique of pure reason, is in a sense to equate ontology with teleology. To argue that ontology, namely the nature of being, is thereby indistinguishable from the nature of purpose. And if you go all the way back to the Aristotelian mode of thinking, the idea was to bring them in alignment. In other words, to say that our purpose had fallen out of sync with our own nature. Hence, you can also see why Aristotle lends himself perfectly to contemporary conservative thinkers who argue that we have simply fallen out of natural life and that we are no longer in sync with traditional family values, etc., and who thereby attribute the root of all social ills to this being out of joint with one's natural purpose, one's ontology, if you will. This is the Aristotelian project. Hegel's philosophical project could not be more different. Hegel is in this sense entirely Platonic and not Aristotelian. Hegel essentially argues that rather than bringing teleology, namely purpose, in alignment with ontology being, that ontology, in a sense, only exists through the fall into purpose. That there is no an sich ontology, no absolute to begin with. That it is the fall from ontology that creates the absolute. In other words, that the absolute exists in its own fall. And here we can start seeing why Hegel would liken this to the idea of love. And love thereby for Hegel is not simply a metaphor, but it's almost like an allegory for the entire functioning of his ontology, an ontology that is marked by its own difference from within. After all, can there be love without the fall? This is more than just a euphemism for love, right? That love requires alienation. That the central principle of falling in love is thereby that you seemed like you were fine, and all of a sudden you were not. That you saw the world one way, and you had a certain guiding principle about what's important to you. And then when you are hit by Cupid's arrow, suddenly nothing is the way it was. Suddenly nothing is okay, nothing is fine, unless you are with that person. Hence also why Plato likens falling in love to suffering from a mental illness, by which you don't act in accordance with your own rationality. You don't act like a reasonable human being. You succumb to all kinds of irrational behavior. And yet, when you are in love, love presents itself to you as your truth. This is one of the beauties of being in love and having requited love, is that When you love somebody else, you learn to see yourself through their eyes. This is also one of the deceptive qualities of the idea of self-love. Absolutely, you should love yourself in order to love others. And yet one of the problems of living within a social media consumer society is that we are told that unless we adequately perform self-love for the gaze of others, by posting pictures of us being happy and having friends, etc., that we are somehow lacking. That a central part of the discovery of the self is thereby the presentation of the self. To prove to others how much you love yourself thereby becomes part of being a participant within the consumer society. And of course, hereby we have presented the ultimate capitalist remedy to this problem. After all, if you think about it, what the consumer society simply does is to create pain points and then to provide you with tailored solutions. Most businesses will be told by their marketing staff that they have to create this narrative, that they are providing solutions. And of course, solutions require problems. And thereby, if you do not sufficiently present as happy, as self-loving, you are sold the solution, which is to purchase goods from those who more effectively or more convincingly present as happy. Celebrities and influencers and people who've made a living repping the idea of self-love. And thereby the idea of self-love becomes the ultimate commodity within capitalism. That you have to prove your self-love to others, and the best way to show your self-love for others is by engaging in consumptive practices on behalf of yourself. If you think about it, it's very easy to see through the ideological machinations, the way in which desire is created, and realize that self-love and individual agency will always be more lucrative within capitalist ideology than the idea of doing something for others. And yet the flip side of this, in typically Hegelian fashion, the unity of opposites, is of course that philanthropists who engage, of course, in the driving forces of capitalism through giant tech monopolies and corporate monopolies, engage in philanthropy, engage in the idea of loving everyone. And thereby you see the two sides of the same coin within capitalism, which is you should spend all your time loving yourself. Let the capitalists and the billionaires love everybody else for you. Love thereby becomes self-love and individualistic, and we can let the loving of others, the collective love, be outsourced to the billionaire philanthropists. It's also why Oscar Wilde once wrote that he always suspected the motives of philanthropists, those who announced that they wanted to end poverty, because if they ended poverty, they would also end philanthropy. Thereby the idea of philanthropy and the universal love of humanity, the idealization and romanticization, even fetishization of human suffering, is thereby precisely what contributes to and upholds the problem. And so again, we should be equally skeptical of the idea of universal love, billionaire philanthropists who claim to be acting on behalf of their unmitigated love for humanity, and the push and the relentless capitalist drive towards investing in self-love. The emphasis that we see, for example, in thinkers such as Jordan Peterson or Liver King, who cannot necessarily be equated except on some things. The idea that you should take care of your own self, your own family, before you think about taking care of others. This outsourcing of the collective to the billionaires is one of the deeply perverted paradoxes within late-stage capitalism. Elon Musk can love humanity as long as we simply look out for our own selves and clean up our own rooms and love ourselves adequately. Thereby, and this is my point, self-love becomes a false universal. If we are all told to love ourselves, self-love is the ultimate false universal that allows us to understand the flip side of this, namely the way in which the idea of universal love is a conjoined twin with the idea of self-love. Now, I want to link this back to the idea of a Hegelian ontology. Remember, I said that Hegel's radical insight is to link teleology to ontology. And yet we haven't fully answered the question why Žižek argues that Hegel is the predominant thinker of love. So let us end on that note. Žižek's argument about love is well known. It's an argument that he takes from the French philosopher Elon, a good friend of his, namely that we cannot have love without the fall. Žižek goes a step further. Žižek argues that love is a disaster, that love is not something that can be easily integrated into your life, that love is a disrupting, alienating force that pulls you out of your participation in life, that it is not healthy for you, that it doesn't present itself as convenient or conducive to your other goals or pursuits. This is part of Alain Badiou's argument about the dating industry. Alain Badiou says that one of the things the dating industry has done, like dating websites, etc., or apps and platforms, is that through the seeming regulation of encounters with other human beings, we've also neutered this disastrous element of love. We've tried to integrate dating and love into our other life. That love thereby becomes a kind of negotiation about how well somebody fits within your preconceived goals and struggles. And this, of course, can be a good thing for some people. And yet overall, it takes away the radical revolutionary nature of love. Now, when I say the revolutionary nature of love, I'm not saying that love is like a slogan, that love equals revolution. Instead, that when you fall in love, you stage a revolution within yourself. That suddenly you can't be happy unless you're with that person. You go through the infatuation stage, or what I think Nietzsche once I don't know if it's Nietzsche. What Nietzsche once it could be Nietzsche or Freud. I apologize if I'm getting it wrong. To Liebeslust, which is the lust of love itself, the pleasure that we take in the fall. And that, like when you fall, suddenly up and down become reversed. The sky and the ground are no longer the central axis of your existence. That to fall in love is a discombobulating experience. Now, Hegel takes the idea of love and uses this alienating substance of love, this idea of the disaster of love, the fall into love, to make what is essentially a metaphysical argument about the relationship between the absolute and the subject. In other words, the absolute and the object, or for Hegel, substance and subject. Within metaphysics, we also see this as the difference between truth and illusion, or essence and appearance. There's many names for this binary, which is a binary that stands at the very heart of the philosophical trajectory. And Hegel argues, and this is a surprisingly simple argument once you think about it through the lens of love, that there is no absolute to begin with, from which the object is a fall. That the absolute exists only within the fall. That the alienating substance of substance itself, which within philosophy has the name subject and subjectivity, is thereby the active agent, the yeast, if you will, of substance, of the absolute. It's almost like and here you can understand why Žižek uses Lacan to talk about Žižek. The Lacanian maxim, which is a structuralist maxim, that the only universal is difference, is thereby exactly true for Hegel as well. The only universal is subject. That subjectivity becomes the sublimating agent of the idea of the absolute. Again, Hegel has a couple of examples of this. Hegel, being a Christian thinker, likens this to the process by which Christ on the cross, in his quote-unquote failure to prove that he is the Son of God according to the logic of the ruling classes, thereby sublimates the idea of God. In other words, that in the moment of Christ on the cross where he says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" we see God doubting himself. We see God, the absolute, succumbing to the particularized substance of subjectivity. And thereby the key moment of the Trinity, of course for Hegel, is the emergence of the human community, the community of the faithful. The idea that God goes from being the absolute, namely the all, into a non-all, in Lacanian terms, of Christ, and then sublimating into the Trinity, into the triad, into the idea of the human community of the faithful. Hence, the post-metaphysical shift in Hegel can be likened to the transition from the Old Testament to the New. The transition from the Old Testament to the New in philosophical terms, not just theological terms, is the idea of a transcendental absolute deity in the sky, from which we have been severed, to the idea of Christ on the cross as a desublimating agent. In other words, God being split from within and thereby being desublimated onto earth, and through the community of the faithful, finding, if you will, the synthesis, the sublimation of God on earth, God in the human community. As Christ says, where you find love, you will find me. Thereby love, namely that which we all have in common, and yet which presents itself as a unique experience that you alone have discovered, love becomes the marker of this difference. Namely, not a universal that succumbs to a particular, nor a particular that arises to the universal substance, but a universal that consists of its own particular. That is love. Love is the process of feeling like you have found your true self, your own individualistic, alienated self. You have discovered love. And yet that is what happens to each and every one of us. Love is the marker of a universal that is made manifest through difference. It's also the Kantian idea of the sublime. Kant's idea of the sublime is very different from the, someone will correct me here. I'm suddenly having a blank. I was going to say Rourke, but it's the Burkean, thank you, the Burkean idea of the sublime. The Burkean idea of the sublime follows the ancient, old, transcendental hypothesis, which is that we have the absolute, and the absolute trickles down, and that there are moments in which we, through beauty, see a reflection of the absolute on earth. It's like you could look at a really beautiful person and you would see a little bit of God in them. That's the Burkean idea of the sublime. The Kantian idea of the sublime is so much more radical. The Kantian idea of the sublime is that there is no absolute that can trickle down. It's that the sublime is that which has as its own content, the impossibility of its form. For example, Shakespeare's famous sonnet where he says, "I love you so much, I couldn't possibly put it into words." That is the sublime. After all, you just put it into words. You put into words that you couldn't put it into words. That is the sublime. Love, that which cannot be expressed, except through the fact that it cannot be expressed. Again, love is like the river that floods its own banks and that consists only of banks. And so the Kantian sublime, the Hegelian ontology, the idea of love for Žižek, the political critique of the false universal, all of these are central and crucial if you want to understand Žižek's philosophy, if you want to understand continental theory, if you want to understand the history of Western philosophy, if you want to understand why Sisyphus is in love with his own symptom in Lacanian terms. Love is so important. Love is perhaps the most important philosophical concept, and yet also the most underrated one. And so what I've tried to do in my book, Sisyphus and Love, is to present you with a 100-page, 5-chapter, easy to understand summary of these ideas, so that hopefully you can use those ideas to then read everything else. Žižek, Badiou, Lacan, Freud, Nietzsche, Plato, Kant, that by using my introduction, Sisyphus and Love, you will have gained an insight into some of the most difficult ideas within the Western canon in a totally accessible way, a way that is intuitive and relatable. That is the goal of this book. Sisyphus and Love is supposed to introduce you to the most difficult ideas within philosophy and psychoanalysis through the most universally relatable lens available. That has been my goal. So thank you guys so much for listening to this short book launch lecture. I'm very, very happy to be sharing this book with you. I'm so incredibly grateful to our patrons who have made this possible. This is really for you. For everybody joining the classes live, I'm so grateful that you take the time out of your week to watch this. It is the biggest gift you could possibly give me. It is such an incredible blessing to start the week in like-minded fashion. It gives me so much joy, and every time I find myself staring into the abyss, I think about you guys. I truly, truly do. This is what gives me hope. This is what gives me energy. Thank you so much. If you'd like to read my book, Sisyphus and Love, it's available for a limited time only on Patreon. You can download it today. It's on www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Plus, if you sign up to purchase the book, you'll get access to all of our other community features, including weekly Q&As, masterclasses, edited transcripts, everything. Plus, and I think this is the biggest part, by becoming a patron, you also support this community on behalf of everybody else. Because I couldn't keep these classes open access, totally unpaywalled, totally available for everyone, which I believe is important because education should be free, without your support. So thank you guys so much. Thank you for all the appreciation and love that I've received. Thank you for letting me do the work that I believe in. I'm so grateful to you, and I very much look forward to hearing from you guys once you've read the book. Once again, the book is called Sisyphus in Love. You can find it at www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Thank you guys so much. I will see you in the Q&A, which I'm going to start recording in about 10-15 minutes for our patrons on Discord. If you'd like to sign up for that, you know where to find it. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.